recordarles que esta conferencia otorga 1.5 CCEs o créditos de educación continua y que pueden solicitar al correo de afiliaciones@icfcolombia.com. Entonces, sin más, voy a pasar a presentarles a nuestro gran conferencista del día de hoy. Quiero pedirles, por favor, si tienen inquietudes, pueden anotarlas en el chat. Nuestro conferencista nos va a acompañar durante 60 minutos en la charla y al final nos va a dar un espacio más o menos de 15 minutos para poder responder como a las inquietudes que tengamos. Quiero contarles de nuestro conferencista de hoy, Jonathan Passmore. Él es un psicólogo especializado en coaching, es coach ejecutivo y supervisor mundialmente reconocido. Está clasificado entre los 10 mejores coaches profesionales del mundo. También ha tenido la oportunidad de ayudar a numerosos líderes en finanzas, tecnología, deportes y gobierno a reflexionar y a obtener nuevas perspectivas y adquirir nuevos conocimientos. Jonathan ha ocupado puestos de liderazgo en las firmas de consultoría Global PwC, IBM Business Consulting, OPM, y fue vicepresidente senior en la Coach Hub. También ha sido director general de una firma de psicología del Reino Unido y fue presidente de la División de Psicología y de Coaching de la Sociedad Británica de Psicología en 2021 y 2022. Ha publicado ampliamente en las últimas 3 décadas sobre liderazgo, cambio, coaching. Su trabajo incluye más de 40 libros y más de 200 artículos científicos y capítulos de libros, que lo convierte en uno de los investigadores de coaching más publicados del mundo. Ahora divide su tiempo entre su práctica privada de coaching, Henley Business School, Reino Unido y la Universidad de Évora en Portugal. Así de que, Jonathan, bienvenido a esta conferencia. Es un placer tenerte acá, nos sentimos honrados y bienvenido, este micrófono es tuyo.
Welcome, Jonathan. It is a pleasure to receive you and to give you the room for you to.
Thank you very much indeed. A couple of things to say, colleagues. First of all, is that the software that Google provides has crashed, so it's given me a new code. So there is the new code that you might want to use. I've been looking at the Spanish translation so the English translation of what you've been hearing, and it tells me a little bit about being bitten by mosquitoes. And what else did it say? How curious people are, that they like being unemployed and watching videos. So I'm not entirely sure that the translation is going to be as accurate as we might hope it's going to be. So I'm going to bear with me.
Jonathan, it's okay.
I don't think Google is that good at translating.
No, don't worry about it. It just happened that because she was speaking in Spanish, he was catching it as if it was English. But once you start speaking English, it's going to perfectly translate everything. Don't worry about it.
Okay, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you, Santiago, that it'll be perfect in English. So,
Yes,
so colleagues, thank you very much indeed for connecting. So it's a total pleasure to be with you this afternoon. And I'm going to be talking about third wave sessions, third wave approaches in coaching. And I'm going to share my screen. That'll guide us through some content. And really what I'm going to be talking about is evidence-based approaches, and with a particular focus on modern evidence-based approaches that are beginning to influence our coaching practice. Some of those you might be very familiar with, so there might be things that you're already using in your practice, but I suspect that some, or even maybe all of the approaches that I'm going to talk about are relatively new to you. And because they're evidence-based, if you were adopting these approaches will certainly enhance your coaching practice and the outcomes that you'll achieve with your clients. And during International Coaching Week, of course, it's always a pleasure for us to be thinking about our coachees, but also thinking about ourselves, thinking about our onward development, that whether you're an ACC whether you're a PCC or whether you're already a master coach. Coaching is a continual journey of reflection and learning as we try to improve our practice in service of our clients. And I hope I will share some ideas that will help you as you aspire towards that particular aim. A couple of other things that I say is that this work is based upon the contents of a book, which is called Third Wave Cognitive Behavioral Coaching. And I'd also say that if you would like to connect to me on LinkedIn, it's always a pleasure to connect with colleagues across the world. So either during the session or at the end of the session, do connect with me. So let's start our journey together by having a little bit of an overview of what we're going to cover. Now, third wave approaches, there's probably a dozen third wave approaches that I could be talking about. So I'm talking in general terms about what does it mean when I'm saying third wave approaches? What are we talking about here? Then I'm going to pick three specific examples. I'm going to talk about MI. This is motivational interviewing. This is predominantly based on the work of two writers, Miller and Rolnick, from the 1980s, who have been developing their approaches really over the last 40 years as a way of assisting in behavioral change. And then I'm going to talk about mindfulness. Some or all of you might have come across mindfulness practices. And I'm going to talk about how we might embed them into our coaching practice for ourselves as part of our self-care, but also for our clients to help them in their well-being, but also in terms of their performance. And last of all, I'm going to talk about DBC, dialectical behavioral coaching. This is probably new to everybody on the call, with the exception of people who might be psychologists and therapists who might have been trained in this specific approach. And this is a therapeutic approach that really emerged in the 1990s and that I and a number of colleagues have been trying to translate into coaching practice to help with behavior change, particularly behavior associated with intense emotions. So we'll give you, if you like, three different, very briefly, explorations of these topics within the wider context of what third wave approaches are. So let's start maybe with a journey that leads us to those third wave approaches, because the obvious question is, I didn't even know there were two previous waves. What are those two previous waves of coaching? So third wave approaches really get their name from the fact that there was, back in the early part of the previous century, the early 1900s, the emergence of behavioral psychology. And this was a reaction to the thinking and writing in the previous century of people like Jung and Freud, who were focusing as really pre-psychologists, exploring what was the mind and how the mind was behaving. And because they had none of the modern neurosciences, they were using talking therapies and early experimental techniques to try and make sense of what was happening in the mind. And the psychodynamic theories suggested that there was both a consciousness, but also a level of unconscious. And this unconscious aspect was driving human behavior, particularly dysfunction. And the work of the psychodynamic therapist was to help people to explore the unconscious, bring it into their conscious awareness. And when they were conscious of it, then they could begin to manage and control these aspects of their personality that were influencing or driving unhelpful behaviors. Well, the behaviorists that emerge, and Pavlov is one example of this, but there were many others. Skinner is another example of these, who said, this is nonsense. This has no evidence behind it. All we can do is observe people's behavior. We cannot enter the black box of the human mind. All we're doing is guessing at what might be going on. The psychodynamic writers are just guessing at what's happening in the mind. Instead, we should observe human behavior and try and make inferences from the behaviors that we see. And particularly, there was a focus around learning. And Pavlov, one example with his work with dogs, Skinner with his work with pigeons, saw that there was a particular set of behaviors associated with learning, or that might stimulate learning. And this led to the stimulus response school of psychology, where if you provide a punishment or a reward, then that leads to particular behaviors. We use that in human resources today. We use that with our children today. So behaviorism has been a very strong driver of how we as humans understand other humans' behavior. So that was the first wave, the behavioral school, a reaction to the psychodynamics. The second wave that emerged really in the 60s and then through the 1970s was the work of people like Beck and Ellis. And in some respects, theirs was a reaction to the humanist school. The humanist school of people like Carl Rogers, Maslow, Csikszentmihalyi, who talked about individuals having within them all of the resources that they need to solve any particular problem. So that feels very coach-like. So person-centered approaches have certainly influenced us in coaching. But Beck and Ellis and others said, well, actually humans need to also understand what's going on and recognize that their beliefs, their thoughts influence their behaviors. And behind the thoughts can sometimes be emotions, feelings, which influence the thoughts that drive the behaviors. And in fact, these three aspects, our thoughts or our cognitions, our emotions or our feelings, and our behaviors are connected. They're like three legs of a stool on a chair, three legs on the chair or the stool. And that we need to help people to recognize the connections between them. Their emotions influence thoughts, thoughts influence behaviors, but sometimes behaviors can influence how we feel and subsequently how we think. So the connections are in every single direction. So this was the second wave, and we know this second wave as cognitive behavioral therapy, and we know it as cognitive behavioral coaching. And many of you probably use cognitive behavioral coaching in the work that you do with clients because of all of the research evidence. This is the one that probably has the most evidence showing that has a positive effect on clients, producing changes in behavior and facilitating an enablement of goal attainment. So that was the second wave. It continued during the 70s and 1980s. Certainly, like person-centered has been significant in informing coaching. And then we got to around about the year 2000, and then a series of third wave approaches have emerged. And here are some of the examples of those. But there is significant debate as to what is third wave approaches that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and how do they differ from second and first wave approaches. So this includes neuroscience. So we're seeing since 2000 a greater exploration and research around what's happening in the human brain. So we can use a series of electronic experiments to understand brain waves and brain patterns and how emotions or activities trigger certain types of pathways and patterns in the brain. We're still at a very early stage of understanding the human brain and its complexity. And broadly, what we can say about the human brain, beyond that it's immensely complicated, is that the human brain seems to have this capacity to work in multi-different ways. That if part of the brain gets damaged, it seems to be able to rewire itself. And secondly, that the learning processes continue throughout our lives with a particular emphasis of certain types of learning at different stages. So language acquisition, for example, typically happens in the period between about 1 year and about 20 years. That after we get sometime into our 20s, it's much harder to learn how to speak Spanish if you're an English speaker than if you were a 3-year-old, which seems very logical from our experiences of our children and probably our own personal experiences. Second model is ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, acceptance and commitment coaching. This is an approach that reframes our cognitive behavioral approaches, and we're not going to go into today, but on another occasion, I'd happily tell you more about ACT. MI, motivational interviewing, we're going to be looking at today, which is a technique that focuses on enhancing people's motivation to act. And it's the first framework or approach we're going to look at today. Mindfulness is going to be the second approach that we're going to have a look at. Also in this bucket is compassion-based therapy, has some similarities with ACT, acceptance and commitment approaches. and has some similarities with mindfulness. And there's good evidence that shows that compassion-based approaches can be very helpful to complement cognitive behavioral second wave interventions. And then the last one on my list, which we'll also look at today, is DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral coaching. So with that, let's move on and look at some of those differences between second and third wave, because sometimes it's not always clear, what do we mean by third wave? Well, like second wave, cognitive behavioral approaches, the third wave focuses on these three elements of what it is to be human: our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. Humans exhibit all three of those. Now, a computer might be able to exhibit behavior. It might be a robot and move from one side of the room to the another. We might be able to replicate with AI coaching tools cognition, and that it appears to manifest thought. It's not thinking, it's an artificial tool, so it's not engaging, but it's engaging in a process that appears to us to be cognition. But what it can't do is feel. And that's certainly a differentiator for us. So humans have cognition and behavior, and especially we have emotion. The next one on my list is about the flourishing and thriving aspects that are common in positive psychology and haven't been a feature of second wave approaches. Second wave approaches have tended to focus on how do we manage the distress or the problem. And the third wave approaches have said, well, instead of looking at overcoming symptoms and just coping with them, we should be instead saying, how can we make the very best of this situation? How can we help our clients to thrive and to flourish? And not surprisingly, some of you are thinking, yeah, that feels like what we do in coaching. So these approaches fit very nicely into a coaching approach. As I mentioned earlier, I think that there are some parallels between third wave approaches and positive psychology, which also talks about people reaching their potential, about thriving, about flourishing, about individuals being at their very best, helping them to move forward rather than focus on overcoming problems from the past. And last of all, which I think has been a factor of both second and third wave, has been a real focus on research and evidence, particularly randomized controlled trials and good scientific evidence that demonstrate, at least in therapeutic environments, that these approaches are evidence-based and robust. What we don't have so much of is the coaching evidence to show that these work. And that's a reflection of the complexity of doing coaching research that, again, I could talk to you on another day about. So let's start by having a look at some of the approaches we cover in the book. And I've just talked about some examples of those. Ones that I haven't talked about as examples already: schema coaching, metacognitive coaching, third generational coaching would be other examples of third wave approaches that we talk about in cognitive behavioral coaching third wave approaches. And we've got experts from each of the areas to write their individual chapters. So you might ask the question, well, when might you use third wave approaches? Because, well, you've already got approaches as coaches that work. Why come to this session? Why change your approach? Well, I would probably say, as a psychologist and as someone who's been fascinated by human behavior for, well, probably all of my life, we know that the more adaptive we are, the more successful we are. The reason why we're the top species on the planet is that we have been highly adaptive over the millennia that has enabled us to cope with many different temperatures, different climates, different food types. And so we've populated the whole planet. And then we've been able to cope with the learning and the change that we've seen in our societies really over the last 10,000 years, as we've moved from hunter-gatherers to an agricultural, to an industrial, and now into a post-industrial digital age. So we're fantastic at learning and adapting. And so I would argue the case that great coaches are able to flex and adapt to use different approaches, different models to meet their client and their client's needs where they are, rather than make our clients come and work with us. In other words, not dancing to our tune our tune might be, well, solution focused or somatic or another approach. If we've only got one dance or one tune that we can sing, that's not as powerful as if we're able to do many different dances with our coaches. If we can work with them as a foxtrot, as a tango, as a waltz, these different approaches mean that we're able to be the best service of them. So for these different approaches, I think neuroscience is very helpful for us understanding who we are as humans, but it's quite difficult to operationalize that scientific approach in our coaching work that we do. Motivational interviewing, I think, is useful where clients are particularly stuck on low levels of motivation. They are blaming maybe other people. They're not sure how to move forward. They're at the stage maybe where they're not even ready for traditional coaching. They're not clearly able to articulate their goal, and that we're not able then to work with them to enable them to move forward. In other words, this is sometimes helpful when it's almost pre-contemplation of a problem. I haven't even aware that I've got a problem. And MI can be very useful at this work. The second one, or third one on my list, should I say, mindfulness, is fantastic at helping individuals to clarify in their decision-making, making them more focused, and also really great at helping people in managing stressful times. So just a client that I'm working with at the moment has an incredibly stressful job. They are leading a sports team. They're the manager of a sports team, which appears on television. And as a result, they are on television on the touchline, giving instructions to their team. And sometimes their team is winning, sometimes their team is losing. It's an immensely stressful hour and a half. And of course, as a manager of a sports team, very high profile team, that if they succeed, they're hailed as a hero. If they fail, they will get dismissed from their job. So it's a very stressful role. Mindfulness can be very helpful in enabling those sorts of individuals to concentrate, to focus, and to manage the stress that they experience. Acceptance and commitment coaching can be useful alongside the traditional CBC. If we've used cognitive behavioral coaching and it's not been helpful, we could use acceptance and commitment. If CBC, cognitive behavioral coaching, is about helping people to dispute irrational thoughts, acceptance and commitment coaching instead focuses on accepting those thoughts and not punishing ourselves for those unhelpful thoughts, not trying to wrestle and argue with them, but saying, yeah, it's okay. My brain's telling me that I'm not the best leader in the organization. This presentation is going to go really badly. So one, in CBC, we would dispute that and say, well, look at the evidence. When did the last presentation that you did, that was successful? What did you do to make it successful? And encourage people to take an evidence-based approach. For there, we would just say, well, okay, thank you very much indeed, that part of my brain, for telling me that presentations are stressful and that sometimes they can go wrong. But I'm going to do my best in this situation to make a useful presentation. So accepting and acknowledging them without being driven by those unhelpful thoughts. Compassion-based approaches are similar in that respect, that it's about allowing ourselves to be kind and gentle, not just to others, but encouraging the client to be gentle and kind to themselves. And DBT, which I'll talk about in a moment, is very helpful where, particularly in therapeutic terms, where there are mental health and clinical conditions, but it hasn't yet been transferred widely into coaching. And I think it can be very helpful where there are intense emotions. And I'm going to give you some examples of where they've happened in my coaching work, and that they may be sometimes useful for the work that you do, where you're working with clients who are experiencing intense emotional feelings, to help the client to manage those emotions. So, motivational interviewing. Oh, it's a slide that builds. Let's start with a definition of this particular approach. So MI, as I say, Miller and Rolnick are the two people, if you go and Google and have a look at that. What is it? It's a collaborative, goal-orientated style of communication focused on change, designed to focus on personal strengths and motivation and commitment to goals, helping the person to explore their own reasons for change within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. Well, again, as you look at many of those words, acceptance, compassion, client-led, goal-focused, motivation, strengths, change, all of that feels very similar to what we do in coaching. So this is why for really the last 20 years, I've been very interested in MI and taking motivational interviewing and applying that into coaching work. It started initially with drugs and alcohol, spread into other health disciplines. But if you visit my personal website, jonathanpassmore.com, there's about a dozen articles applying MI, or how we as coaches can apply MI into our coaching practice. And I think it's very helpful in a whole host of ways from the work that we do. So a question, I suppose, for you to reflect on for a moment. How often do you notice in coaching conversations people behaving like this list, where clients are arguing either with other people or with you? Maybe they're interrupting other people, or they're interrupting themselves, saying it's not possible to change. Maybe they're in disagreement. They deny, that they blame other people for the problems that they're experiencing. They excuse themselves, or they discount the impact of their behavior on others, or change the subject. Now, not all clients do this, but probably many of you have encountered these sorts of behaviors in clients in the past, where the issue is my horrible boss. And if my boss wasn't there, I wouldn't have a problem at work. Oh, it's the fact that there isn't enough resources in the team, or the fact that they don't provide training for my team. That's why we're underperforming. An individual who's always ready to find excuses and blame and responsibility elsewhere. And these are really resistant behaviors. These are behaviors that when we spot them, we recognize as coaches, we can't change their boss. We can't change the organization resources. And maybe this individual is not able to change them either. They might be able to influence them, but who's the person they are able to change? Themselves. And the work that we do as coaches is holding the mirror up to this situation, helping the individual to recognize their responsibilities are to themselves, and seeing themselves as a potential agent and taking responsibility for their situation of change. So in this situation, we're trying to help them to overcome a problem where there's denial, where they don't understand the impact of their behavior on others, and they don't know how to make a change at the moment. Or maybe there's a situation where their motivation is very low and they don't care. I've certainly had situations where people are referred by the organization for coaching because they're having a negative effect, and their initial response is say, well, let them sack me, let them, leave the organization. I don't care about any of them. They're all horrible people there. So what do we want to be doing in these situations? Well, at the core of this, what we're trying to explore is around the problem of ambivalence. People, if you talk to them at one stage in the day, they'll say, I don't care, it's all horrible, it's all their fault. At another stage in the day, when they're being more reflective, maybe they're less sure about this situation. Maybe there is an acknowledgement that there is part of it that they're contributing to. So sometimes they're in two minds. Yes, it's partly my boss, it's partly me. Maybe I should change, maybe I should stay the same. I want to be true to my values. But if I am entirely staying the same, that may come with consequences. So we're trying to often deal with an issue connected to ambivalence, where there's that lack of certainty. If the person really didn't like the organization, well, they would have left. They would have got themselves another job. Why are they still there? Why are they still involved in this tangling situation? So our role as a coach is to help them to explore that ambivalence. Do they want to leave? Do they want to make a change? Or do they want to stick to their guns? Do they want to stay in the organization? And to help them to decide in what's best for them, but being aware of the implications of the decisions that they're making. So we're making and enabling them to be more choiceful, aware of the benefits and also the consequences of the choices that they're making. So one tool in this approach is what I call decisional balance, where we're looking at change and no change in a situation. And decisional balance really is about helping the person to map out verbally, or sometimes on a piece of paper or on a digital whiteboard, what are the advantages of making a change? What are the disadvantages of making the change? And then what's different about MI is moving to the other situation, the other side of these weighing scales of the no change environment. What are the advantages of staying the same? And what are the disadvantages of staying like this? And of course, for any choice that we make, even when we don't make a choice to change, we are making a choice to stay the same. And staying the same comes with benefits. I'm being true to myself, but also might come with consequences. And so helping our clients to explore each of those aspects, to map them out, and to then think, well, now I'm aware of them, what are the choices that I now want to make about staying the same or making the change? One of the things in MI, because it is often related to unhealthy behaviors, MI encourages people to focus on talking more about making the change. So we can do that in conversational approaches by asking more questions about this. So tell me more about the advantages of making a change would be a question. Of course, if we want people to stay the same, we'd ask them more questions about the advantages of staying the same. What the evidence tells us is the more that someone talks about the benefits of a particular behavior, it builds their belief in that behavior. So we could, if we chose to, in a conversation, if we were being manipulative, lead clients in a particular direction. But as coaches, that isn't our objective. Instead, our objective is to encourage the person to lay this out, to explore more fully all of the aspects, and then to invite them to consider where they might want to go, having set out all of the advantages and disadvantages of change and no change. So this is maybe a little bit different from the therapeutic approach where I'm going to flip onto that. That's a slide that builds. Here's another building slide, but I'm going to just move that on. Oh, I'm going to move that back, sorry. So what we're trying to do in this process is first of all starting building a relationship. In MI, we start by building and engaging, getting the person to talk. We listen, we empathize, we don't judge. When the person then is ready to do so, we start to encourage them to focus on the topic that really is the essence of the challenge that they're facing. So we call that focusing. And we focus the client by asking questions directly related to this when they're ready to do so. The third stage of a coaching conversation using MI is evoking. And here we're encouraging the person, as I've just done on that illustration from the balance sheet, is drawing out their reasons, their hopes and fears about making changes. So, and if we're trying to facilitate a change, we know that by the more the person talks about it, if that really is their goal, we get them to talk more about making the change, more about the benefits of that. That builds their hope, that builds their belief, and it enhances their motivation. What's the evidence for this? Well, this is from the work of a man called Festinger, and he's talked extensively from research about how particular talk patterns lead to enhancing motivation. Then the last aspect is around the planning process, and much of our coaching work often concentrates here. But as you can see from the MI approach, we start building the relationship, we allow the client to focus on the issue, then we build their belief that they can make a change, we build their confidence in this and their hopes before we move on to the planning process. And the planning process is very much about what we would typically do in coaching. So we don't rush it, we allow the client to develop a plan by exploring what some of their options are. We help them to then consider about the resources and the allies that they might need, people who might hold them to account, and then to make small tentative steps. Because all plans, the evidence tells us that small goals successfully achieved build up for larger goals, and that builds a momentum towards making a permanent change. The other thing that's different around MI to much of the traditional coaching models is that we sometimes believe in coaching that once people have got a plan, they've gone out and done it, then they've made the change. Now, I don't know about you, but I find behavior change really hard. Every new year, I commit myself to going to the gym and keeping fit. And I sign up for one of those gym memberships. You might be the same, or I say I'm going to go for a run, every other day, or I'm going to do this fitness exercise. Promise myself I'm going to do it. And in January, fantastic. Jonathan, you are a star. There I am pounding the streets or doing the push-ups of a morning. February, it's been a bit busy. I only done it once this week. By March, the whole plan has gone. So we often commit to things and then we slip or we have relapses back to our old patterns of behavior. We get too busy, things take over. When clients do that, often clients beat themselves up and they say, oh no, that's it. I ate that big slice of cake, or I didn't go to the gym, or I didn't do that behavior that I said. It's all finished, and they give up. In MI, what we're encouraging people to do is to recognize that's going to happen and to say to themselves, that's okay. Forgive yourself. It's all right to allow slips and falls, slips and errors, relapses, because that's just the progress. Just because you didn't do it yesterday doesn't mean to say that you're not going to do it tomorrow. So you've got a plan, just implement your plan the next day. Yes, you had a big slice of cake. That doesn't mean to say your diet is completely a failure. You didn't go to the gym on Tuesday, doesn't mean to say you can't go to the gym on Thursday. Keep going with the plan. Relapses and slips are just part of the change process. So one of these aspects is about really encouraging people to be forgiving of themselves. So that's a little bit about motivational interviewing in a very short, fast track. So let me just stop to catch a breath and maybe open up, because we've only got 20 people on the call, to take any questions from you about MI and about how that works before we move into the second tour. So any questions or any reflections on that? Santiago, can you host those? Maybe if people type them in Spanish, you can translate them to English for me.
Absolutely, sir. Bueno, para todos, Jonathan nos está abriendo un espacio pequeño antes de continuar. Si alguno de ustedes tiene preguntas específicas sobre la metodología de motivational interviewing, que es relacionado a entrevista motivacional, y cómo se relaciona con el coaching, pueden poner sus preguntas en el chat y vamos a responderlas. Jonathan, maybe perhaps we can gather the questions and then at the end of the presentation just do like a holistic Q&A. If that works for you?
I'd be happy to do that, Santiago. So let me carry on then. And I'm going to dive into my second example, which is mindfulness. So I've talked about Miller and Rolnick being the main writers in the space for motivational interviewing. Jon Kabat-Zinn, an American mindfulness practitioner, has really popularized mindfulness for the Western approach to mindfulness. Clearly, it's an ancient Eastern tradition and is continued in many parts of Asia as people's day-to-day practice. And it was really only in the 1980s that Kabat-Zinn started to introduce mindfulness and started to popularize that. And of course, in therapy, as well as in coaching, people recognize that this might be a very useful tool for us to draw upon. So what is mindfulness? Well, we could very simply say it's present moment awareness without judgment. The quote here says, mindfulness is simply a practical way to be more in touch with the fullness of your being through a systematic process of self-observation, self-inquiry, and mindful action. There's nothing cold, analytical, or unfeeling about it. The overall tenor of mindfulness practice, gentle, appreciative, and nurturing. So for me, present moment awareness, non-judgmental. So we're not, as we are in this moment experiencing what's going on for us, we're not evaluating and not being critical of what our mind is doing. And when our mind wanders off to thinking about, oh, when this webinar is going to be over. I've got another coaching session in half an hour's time. Or thinking about our children or our parents or about our dog. What are we doing with them? Or something that happened the weekend. We capture our mind and we bring it back to the here and the now. We don't punish ourselves for that wandering mind, and we try and stay in the present moment. And many of these techniques often involve breath or focusing on a particular saying or repetitive chant. Depends on individual preferences. So what's the research tell us about mindfulness? Evidence-based approach, lots of strong evidence that it's good for well-being and performance. When we look at performance, we're showing it has an effect on the brain. So it improves working memory, attention, and also stability, control, and overall performance efficiency. So, whoa, this is highly positive for us as humans to be engaging in this. And it's almost like if you were could choose anything that you could go and do, a 5 or 10 minute mindfulness meditation each and every day for you or for your client is certainly going to have positive effects for them. And then we can see from a range of different studies that I've quoted here, it also has other positive effects for individuals, some from self-report effects, but also seems to have wider health benefits for individuals: cancer treatment, blood pressure levels, improving immunity, anxiety, and depression. And so not surprisingly, it's being widely recommended in many health economies to help individuals with mental health problems, as well as physical health issues, and seems to be spreading into multiple organizations. So Google has its own mindfulness program, as do many other organizations. And when we look at performance at work, here's a range of studies for those people who like this sort of stuff. You take a photo of the presentation, and of course you could go and read these individual studies or quote them to your clients. If your clients say to you, why are you recommending mindfulness? Well, here's some great pieces of evidence of why it helps in terms of manager ratings, helps in terms of performance delivery, helps in relation to employee engagement. So lots of super great evidence that it's a useful practice. And what we're not suggesting is people need to sit on their desks and do, it can be a very simple practice, as short as 5 minutes a day before people head off to work, for example, or when they come home of an evening to do this before they switch on Netflix or the television to watch the news. I won't go into even more studies for you. Let me just, while I go back, sorry, I'm going in the wrong direction now. Let's go back. What I will say about what we could do in terms of our coaching application, let me focus there. So I think there are 4 things that we can particularly use mindfulness for. The first of those is to get in the right mental state to do our coaching work. So for me, I'm often jumping from meeting to meeting, usually on a screen, and to have a mindfulness meditation might be just a 3 or 4 minute, and there are multiple clips that are available on YouTube and on many other platforms, on digital platforms that you could access. Download it into your phone, and you can make use of that. Just when you feel as though you're distracted, your brain's going, just a short mindfulness meditation during the course of the day, when instead of you're making a cup of coffee, or maybe while the kettle is boiling, while the coffee is being made, you can do your breathing exercise, your focusing mindfulness exercise to help you to prepare for the next session. Second thing that we can do is just being aware during coaching conversations of our wandering minds. Now, probably you're all fantastic coaches, and it's only me that does this, but occasionally, just occasionally, my mind wanders off. And here I am, I'm talking to a client, and I'm thinking, you know what? We're getting a bit low at milk at home. I'm going to have to make sure I pop out and get some milk for children's breakfast tomorrow morning. Otherwise, we're fine. They won't be able to have their cereal. And there am I, the client's talking about all of these problems, and I'm thinking about my shopping list. It might happen to you. A few of you are smiling there. These are things that naturally humans, we have a wandering mind. We get distracted. if our brain gets overloaded with information and we wander off. So mindfulness is a great way of just capturing that wandering mind, not punishing ourselves for the fact that that's happened, but bringing ourselves back to the present moment and to the client to stay focused on them. A third way that we tend to use mindfulness in coaching practice is about controlling the ups and downs that we can sometimes feel after the work that we do, because we get connected to our clients. And so supervision is a great way of supporting ourselves and being able to talk about issues and patterns. But mindfulness can also help us deal with the emotions that we experience. When we connect to clients, we feel happiness and joy, or we can feel immense sadness, anger and frustration, disgust and contempt. I've experienced all of those emotions over the years in my work with clients. And to be able to continue to be friendly to clients without being their friend, continue to be friendly without feeling as though the client is the enemy. So this ability to be in relationship, to be also managing the appropriate distance with our clients, mindfulness can help us manage that emotional connection and separation. And then last of all, I tend to use mindfulness as a way of teaching it to clients. I don't run a teaching session in a coaching, but I say, go and have a look, listen on YouTube, go on. I can recommend this as some experiment to go and play with for the next week or the next 2 weeks before we meet again. See how you get on. Just try 5 minutes a day. How does that sound to you? Find something on YouTube, find a short clip, and then the individual does that, and then we'll discuss the next time that we meet up how they've got on with that particular activity. And often, I would say more than 80% of the time, clients come back and say, it's been fantastic, I'm going to carry on doing this. I didn't realize that I could do it in 3 or 4 minutes, and how beneficial I found that to be. I don't do it every day, but I've done it 5 days out of the 7, and I'm going to keep doing this. And then I might speak to them at the end of the coaching, and they're still doing it. It's still part of their regular practice that they're doing it 3, 4, 5 days a week. So think about how you might introduce mindfulness as a third way to approach, complementing the other things that you're doing with clients. The last one that I wanted to touch on, and as an example, is dialectical behavioral coaching. And we really today have just had a little tapas, a little taster of these 3 different approaches. One might say, if you are French speakers, an amuse-bouche. I'm sure that there's an equivalent Spanish phrase for that, just a little mouthful that gives you a sense of these different approaches. And we could spend 3 days looking at each of these different approaches to give you more depth. But the third one, dialectical behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral coaching, is a psychotherapeutic approach that's been used, particularly with mental health conditions, borderline personality disorder, and is informed by Buddhism, behaviorism, and also dialectics, conversational-based approaches. Get people to talk about their issue, to be aware of their behaviors, and to be accepting of themselves. So lots of connections into acceptance and commitment coaching, lots of connections into the mindfulness approaches that I've been talking about already. So you might be thinking, well, I don't deal with mental health problems in coaching. So how does that make a difference? How can behaviorism, how can Buddhism, how can this sort of dialectical conversational exploration be helpful to me in the work that I'm doing? Well, I suspect that you are dealing with clients on some occasions who experience intense emotions. Clients who feel something very powerfully, and that emotion sometimes then leads to behaviors that are unhelpful in their interactions with other people, maybe their interactions with their boss. Well, what's the evidence for DBT? For those people who like science and evidence, I'm not going to go through these, but lots of good evidence that it has a reasonable positive effect, similar to other types of evidence-based approaches. And it's particularly helpful where emotions are at their strongest, where people are experiencing anger or aggression. They might be self-harming, but more likely in the coaching work that we do, they are harming other people by things that they do or things that they say. So we're talking about behaviors where people shout, where people throw things across the room. And I've certainly had clients who have thrown things across rooms. Staplers, for example. You would have thought a stapler, something that you put together, pieces of paper, wouldn't become a missile, but for some people that overcome with the anger or emotion becomes a missile that they throw across the room. In fact, we've had a recent politician, I won't mention the name because we're recording, but a recent politician in the UK who had to resign because of their outbursts of behavior that were considered to be bullying and threatening to other staff. And this person was a very, very senior national politician. I have worked certainly with leaders who have been in very similar situations where the organization said, you need to change your behavior or you're going to leave the organization. So how can we help people to do this? There's a range of different frameworks and models within dialectical behavioral coaching that we can draw upon. And one of them is called the accepts model. And as with many models, each of the letters starts for a particular thing that we explore with the client that they can do. So the first of those, accepts, is activities. Activities are engaging in things that the client can do that they enjoy doing. So I encourage the client to first of all acknowledge that this is an issue that they need to deal with. Secondly, that they are committed to thinking about more broadly how that they start to be aware of and start to change their behavior. And the first thing then is where I'll explain the model, and then I'll go through each of the elements in this model for them to experiment with different things that might help them. So activities might be, I loved playing tennis when I was at university. I've stopped doing that now. So, okay, why don't you in the coming week, try and make sure, or the coming month, you make sure that you have at least one tennis match that you arrange outside of work to do this. So what I often find with these people is that their identity is defined by the role that they do. So they have no other activities outside of work, that they get in early in the morning, they work to very late at night. And so they're so passionate, it's a very good strength, but then that passion leads to them identifying they are their job is them. And so every decision matters, and it matters to the minutest detail. Nothing else in their life exists. So by doing other activities, we start to say, well, actually, you're more complex than your job. You are part of your job, but you're also not just a manager in the organization, you're also a tennis player. Then encourage the person to think about their wider activities outside of work. What do they like doing? Do they like helping school children? So maybe they could go into the local school to help young children to read. Maybe they're really concerned about the environment. Maybe they should join a book group and read a novel and then discuss the novel with other people. So thinking about their contribution to other people in the community, helping in a variety of different ways. Third thing I encourage people to do is be more aware of what's happening in the world, because we often forget that we are blessed. We are blessed 1,000 times over. You and I on this call, you are connecting in on a digital device that allows you to speak to me in a different country. We're using technology that allows my English to be translated to your Spanish. We have work, we have meaningful work, we probably have families and health. And there are billions of people who are in war-torn situations, billions of people who have to walk more than 2 or 3 kilometers to get clean water, who are wondering where their next meal is coming from, who are living in refugee camps. And we are blessed 1,000 times over that we go to our food cabinets, we have clean water, we have digital devices, we have our health. So thinking about, for our clients, getting them to think about how they are fortunate in the world that they live in. And many of my clients, and probably many of yours, are leaders and managers who are very, very well paid, have cars and drivers, have lovely houses, have families and good health, and that they don't recognize just how blessed they and we are in the lives that we're leading. We are blessed not just in comparison to other people on our planet. But when we compare ourselves to maybe 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago, the health and technology and opportunities that we have available to us and to them, we're living the dream of kings from 1,000 years ago. So getting people to make comparisons to time. Next one on my list is about focusing on positive emotions. Often people focus on what's not going well, so we get them to think about what are the things that are going well. One particular technique that's very good for doing this is Martin Seligman's 3 good things. At the end of the day, think about your day. What are the best 3 things that have happened today? Write them down on a little notepad and collect over the course of this week, this month, the 3 good things that have happened each and every day. And as you write those 3 good things down, write the feelings that you've associated with that event. Surprise, joy, happiness. Write them down. And as we get the person to think about that and then write it down, they're reconnecting with that feeling. So the more our brain experiences positive events, the neural network builds in that particular direction, and it strengthens the neural network to notice the positive things that are happening. And so when we're spending more time noticing the positive, experiencing the positive, that's a great counterbalance to focusing on the negative things that drive the anger, the frustration, and those unhelpful behaviors. Next on the list, push away. Put the situation aside for a moment. So if there's something that's frustrating the person, do we need to make a decision about this now? Let's come back to that next week. So encouraging them things that are triggers for them to push that away. Allow them to have time to think about it and not be driven into engaging in a situation. We all know how unhelpful it is for us to respond to an email that comes through. We see it in our email box and it's not the news that we want, and we punch out an email as a reply. We're just about to press send. Let's just hold that, going to put that into draft. Let me come back to that tomorrow. Let me come back to that in 2 days when the emotion has just subsided for a moment. Then we read through it. Ooh, I'm glad I didn't send that email. That's very rude of me to say that. Oh gosh, I can imagine how the person's going to respond. Let me just rephrase this. It's exactly the same. Delaying our response enables that person to take a more considered view that takes into account the other person's position, whilst also allowing them to express their thoughts on it in that considered way. Next one, thoughts. Think about something else. This is a distraction technique. So we could sometimes get the person to wear a rubber band. So a great thing that people often do is that they're very used to checking their phone habitually, and they're checking their emails or they're checking their Facebook, whatever. Get them to put a rubber band around their phone. So every time they go to the phone, they have to remove the rubber band. So it's just another barrier that stops the person doing it, and they're more aware of that habituated behavior. This is the same type of approach. Think about something else. So instead of being drawn into the conversation, take a break. Just going to go for a comfort break. Let's just stop for a few minutes in the meeting. Let's go and get a coffee and we'll come back and talk about this. And that provides the opportunity to then talk about something else before they come back in to engage in this issue. And then the last one is experiencing intense sensations. This is a little bit like comparisons. Comparison of things that are less fortunate. Sensations is experiencing extreme sensations. People often are very closeted in a air-conditioned office. Nothing very much changes. So go for a walk in the desert. Take a cold shower of a morning. Go and eat a very spicy food that you don't usually eat, or equally do something else where there is swimming in a cold lake. Experience the fullness of life allows you to put things more in context. When we're only swimming in one water, and there's often the story about putting a frog into boiling water, the frog will leap out. And if you heat up the water gradually, you can boil a frog alive. I've not done this, by the way, just for any of you who are people caring about animals. But it is said you can boil the frog alive because he doesn't notice how the water is changing. And that's exactly the same for some people in organizations. The temperature goes up and up and up. They don't notice how the temperature, their feelings are going up in the organization, that they're closeted there. Get out, experience different things, smell the wildflowers, feel the wind on your face, be cold, be hot, and get a sense that actually there's things outside of that little pond, little pool, little container that you're in that's unhelpful to your behavior currently in the workplace. So that's the accepts models part of DBT. So let me just try and come back and draw some of these things together as the journey that's really happening in the coaching field and psychotherapy more generally. So I talked at the beginning about psychotherapy, how back in the, well, really 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, we had Freud and Jung and the dynamic unconscious. That informed the development of behaviorism, which was the first wave. And that's the work of people like Skinner and Pavlov. There was Watson as well, and led to the stimulus response behaviors. Then we had the humanistic school, Maslow, Carl Rogers, and this certainly has been very influential in the development of coaching and the belief that the solution sits within the individual. That's not the only thing that we need to do. As coaches, we can draw upon other interventions like cognitive behavioral approaches. And so cognitive behavioralism, a second wave of interventions, CBC has emerged, and we've seen some examples there. Most of these focus on disputation. So challenging people's unhelpful or lack of evidence-based thinking. Then we've had a resurgence of humanistic approaches, positive psychology with Seligman and others. And what I focused on today very much is those third wave approaches that I've described here. But I don't think that's really the end of the process. Really what we can start to do as coaches is draw from all of these traditions with a focus on what's the evidence that they work, and that we need to move away instead from branded approaches to focus on a process where we integrate these with our clients. We draw from those different elements, just like when we go to a dance, we engage in the waltz, then the tango, then the foxtrot. We're not thinking that we are, oh yes, now's the time for the foxtrot. Instead, we are just dancing to the music and with our partner. And the same way, the same approach needs to be what we do in coaching, that we dance taking account of the music, the system that the person's operating within, and the individual, the client who's standing in front of us. And it's them that is leading in the dance as we dance to the music, and we dance with them in this process that facilitates them to make change. So let me stop at this point and come back to Santiago for questions that you might have asked. And I call this process-based coaching. So, discussion and questions.
What a spectacular presentation. Para todas las personas que hablan en español, mi nombre es Santiago Barragán, soy el director de educación continua del capítulo y para mí fue un grato placer tener la posibilidad de compartir este espacio y de tener a Jonathan compartirnos todo este conocimiento. Por favor, pongan sus preguntas en el chat y estaremos moderando con nuestra presidente Betsy las preguntas. For the people who are speaking in English, my name is Santiago Barragán. I'm the Director of Continuous Education of the chapter. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll be moderating the conversation. So stick for a little bit longer and we'll answer a couple of questions. So, Jonathan, maybe we can, yeah, beautiful. So many schools train coaches on specific competences. So that are very specific to certification process, and that's it. But do you have any encouragement for coaches to really do what you have done and learn about the long history of cognitive and behavioral approaches for human development and flourishing?
So I would say that the ICF competency framework is the common threads that run through many of these different approaches. So at the heart of that, we're trying to evoke awareness. We're actively listening with clients. We're acting ethically. So those common sets of behaviors that are contained in the ICF competencies are really just the starting point, the process. And they're like the instruments, maybe like I'm trying to carry on my metaphor of music and dancing. They're like the drums and the violin and the cello. But the music that they create is the different approaches. And of course, what we then need to do is to dance appropriately to the music with our client. Because if we're trying to do the foxtrot to a tango, it's going to be a terrible mess. They're still playing the same instruments, it's still the same competencies that are being used. And of course, we need to master those competencies first before we can play the different tunes. Is that helpful?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question from Marian. Any tips for books or readings regarding dialectic behavioral therapy?
Ooh, super question. So I would say that, of course, I would say I'd refer you to our book. I'm going to get it down from that little cupboard. So I'd refer you to this because there's a great chapter on this in here as it applies to coaching. I think that's the only thing that's been written about DBT in relation to coaching that I'm aware of. Nobody else has been doing any other work in the take of dialectical behavioral therapy and applying it to coaching. Otherwise, a lot of the work has been done by Lynham, and she has written a number of books and guides too. So this is Marsha Lynham. I'd go and say, have a look at her work.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you, Marilyn.
I'm curious to know, what is something that is well accepted today in industry that you might disagree, that you might challenge, and that you think coaching in the future will look different at?
Ooh, now you're going to ask me to be controversial, Santiago. So hold on to your seats, colleagues. So I think we have an existential threat to coaching. And that existential threat is the emergence of AI, and in particularly GPT and GPT-based languages. And you will already see this emerging. So there are a number of AI coaching apps. So there is Amy, Coach Hub's Amy that's emerged. There is one called Vici, Air Consulting have another one. It's less of a coach. Evouch have a product as well. These are very early stages, and over the next, it's always very difficult to predict the future. Sometime over the next 2 to 5 years, we will see the growth and popularization of those tools. And we as coaches, and there may be 100,000 of us worldwide, because we're like a librarian, and we're able to, when the person comes into the library, we can say, oh yeah, you're looking for a book. Let me go and take you to the shelf. Have a look at these books that are here. You want to find a crime novel. Here's the crime section. Which one were you? And the person chooses their book to then take it out. But AI is like Google. You don't need to have the librarian show you where it is. You type in your question and it comes back with the answer. We have a cost that we need a certain level of income to pay for our food and our time and our housing costs, etc. There is zero cost for an AI app. Also, Betsy, you're only available at certain times because you've got to spend time with your family, you've got to do other things. And then I think, well, I've seen Betsy, but I'll go to Diana. Oh, well, both of you, well, I'm assuming this is the case, neither of you speak Japanese. Well, I want to have my coaching session in Japanese, but I want to have it at Colombian time. Well, an app never takes holidays, never sick, never has its family to look after, and will speak in all languages, hopefully slightly better than Google Translate does. But over time, we'll be able to have a conversation at zero cost in any language that you like, and is always going to be available. So I can see a time potentially where coaching is just an app on your phone and is funded not by you paying $5 a month, although that is one monetization model. The other model that Google and many of the other, YouTube, etc., use is that they take our data and then use the data to sell us advertising. So I can see a time in the future where the AI app is free for you as the consumer, but it takes your data, and you've talked about your interest in, I don't know, presentation skills. Well, then you get lots of emails, or you get connected with the opportunity to do presentation skills training, or you're interested in something else. You've talked about some other, you then get targeted for that. That's what happens on Google. That's what happens on YouTube. That's what happens with many of these free apps, that we trade our personal data for that free service. And I can see coaching potentially moving in that way. This is an existential threat for us. The benefit, of course, is it takes coaching from maybe thousands of people to billions of people, truly democratizing coaching. The downside is we have spent years and years and years developing our skills. Does that mean that there's going to be no coaches in the future? Well, I think that we need to really differentiate ourselves from AI. There are still libraries, there are still librarians. The thing that we need to do, I would argue, is that we need to emphasize empathy and sense of humor and playfulness. Computers are terrible at those things. They're not very good at empathizing. They're not very good as having a sense of humor, and they're not very playful and creative. You, Diana, are the most creative, the most humorous, the most empathetic human being, because you're human, and the AI app can't do that. So we need to bring those aspects of our humanity and emphasize them. And the other things that we're able to do, I think, is people do like speaking with people. So if people can afford it, the senior executives will be drawn to speaking to humans rather than computers. So we need to emphasize our humanity, our playfulness, our creativity, and our human brand, so they come to choose Diana rather than an AI app. The AI app becomes the complement, yeah, I want a 5-minute conversation about this, but when I'm going to get deep and personal and talk about my feelings, Diana is the person I'm going to choose, because she understands me, she smiles at me, she nods. Computers never able to do that. Sorry, Diana, I've used you as my example, but you've got a lovely smiling face while I've been presenting, so thank you. I hope that was okay.
We'll have 2 more questions, and then we'll have the wrap-up closure of our president. So we have a question from Masa Hariri. Is the somatic coaching also in the 3rd wave?
Sorry,
somatic
Santiago.
coaching.
So you say the question again?
Is somatic coaching also within the 3rd wave approaches?
Oh, so that is a very good question. I would say no. I personally, in my classification, would say that somatic is much more to do with the body and focusing on that. And I wouldn't classify it as a 3rd way approach. And I know how popular somatic coaching has been, particularly in South America. It's one of the more dominant strands. Interestingly, when we look at other parts of the world, it isn't very popular. And I think that many parts of the world can look to somatic approaches to add that to their coaching. Paying attention to our body, I'll give you a lovely example. I'm not particularly a somatic coach, but I think that it is helpful to clients to pay attention to their body and what that tells them. And I had a client, this is an interesting or amusing story, who told me that they had a neck ache, and they was like, oh, I've got this terrible neck ache. Don't understand it. I said, oh, you should just go and chat to your doctor about that, because he'd never mentioned the neck ache in the previous times I'd met him. I said, you haven't done anything. No, it's just went to his doctor, and doctor asked him some questions. Okay, I think we're just going to whip you down to a hospital. I think you should go now. So they arranged for him to be taken down to hospital. Had a triple height bypass operation. And they said, if you hadn't come down, you could have, within the next 2 weeks, dropped down dead. Body was telling him something, that the stress had built up, and he was experiencing it, was manifesting as a neck ache. And he said, wow, you just saved my life. I said, well, I didn't. I said, the doctor did that, was able to diagnose that. But it was just strange that you were reporting this, that your body was communicating with you, saying something is not right. And we should pay more attention to these aspects of what it is to be human, because also our physiological sensations alongside our emotions, cognitions, and behaviors are important parts. So I wrote a paper around extending our model to take more account of these behavioral, bodily sensations, because it's a great clue to us along with our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. I'm sure many of you have got some great stories as well from your own practices. I've got about 5 more minutes before I'm going to need to hop, and I have equally stolen lots and lots of your time. So maybe, Santiago, one brief question for us to finish by 1/2 past.
Absolutely. The last question would be, where would you like to point people to continue learning about who you are and about your work? Because I don't know everyone else, but I find it extremely fascinating.
So I have a website that contains probably over 100 articles that are available for you to access for free. So jonathanpassmore.com. If you go onto that page, and on the resources page, there's details of my books, but also 100+ articles. Find the topic, type it in, and it will bring up some articles in English, I'm afraid, for you to be able to read. But things there, Google's much better at translating word than it is spoken language, from what I can see on the screen. And I hope that you've been able to follow in some way my presentation to you today. And thank you very much for spending time with me. I hope we get to do this again, and do connect on LinkedIn, and I can carry on the conversations with some of you there. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was wonderful to have you in Colombia today. What a wonderful opportunity from technology, right?
Absolutely right, Betsy. It's a delight to be here, and how blessed we are. How blessed we are.
Yes, yes, we are. We will be waiting for you here in Colombia. You can come and visit us, and we hope that this will be the beginning of so much activity, so much conversation, many conversations with you. I'd be
delighted to come over and come and see you. I travel a lot around to ICF conferences the world. I noticed that we had 2 years where everything was online, and just in the last 6 or 9 months, people are coming back together again for physical conferences. So maybe at some stage in the future, I'll come over and meet you all in person. That would be a delight.
Okay, you will hear about me through LinkedIn. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias, ICF Colombia. Muchas gracias a nuestros participantes, a nuestra audiencia por habernos acompañado el día de hoy. Seguimos en la Semana Internacional del Coaching y ahora les voy a compartir el código de descuento. Si tú eres coach de ICF y quieres renovar tu membresía, hay un código de descuento vigente por poco tiempo. Déjenme compartir pantalla un momento y les muestro. Si eres coach de ICF y deseas renovar tu membresía, puedes aprovechar este código de descuento solo desde el 8 de mayo al 17 de mayo. If you are a coach from ICF and you would like to renew your membership, you can use this promo code and during this period. También recuerda que estas conferencias dan créditos de educación continua, otorgan créditos de educación continua y los puedes pedir a través de afiliaciones@icfcolombia.com. Esperen un momento, no se vayan porque necesito compartirles la encuesta de satisfacción. Mañana no se pierdan que vamos a tener acá a Marcia Reynolds y vamos también a tener a Luisa Torres con Juan Sebastián. Déjenme les comparto un momentito acá el link. Estaba tan emocionada escuchando a Jonathan que no copié a tiempo el link. Todas estas conferencias fabulosas, aquí está el link para evaluar por favor su experiencia. Para nosotros es importante escuchar su opinión. Bien. Tenemos Marcia Reynolds para saber cómo podemos nosotros aprovechar el coaching para ver posibilidades más allá de la niebla del miedo el día de mañana a las 9 de la mañana y a mediodía, herramientas para líderes y coaches en la era de la inteligencia artificial. Por favor, dale clic al link que acabas de ver en el chat para que evalúes esta experiencia de aprendizaje. En ICF Colombia queremos escuchar tu opinión porque queremos traer en la programación eventos que sean interesantes para ti y de utilidad práctica. Gracias a todos por acompañarnos hoy. Thank you so much, Jonathan. We will be waiting for you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed, colleagues. It was lovely being with you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.